Professor Alistair Finch stared at the two identical papers, a cold fury building in his chest. It was plagiarism, open and shut, the kind of lazy cheating he'd seen 1,000 times. But as his eyes traced the elegant, impossible logic flowing across the pages, the fury turned to disbelief, and then to a heart-pounding awe that would soon shake the foundations of the mathematical world. He didn't know it yet, but these two papers, from two suspended high school students, held a secret that geniuses had chased for 20 years. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The late afternoon sun cast long, lazy rectangles of light across the worn linoleum floor of the classroom at Northwood High. The air, thick with the scent of chalk dust, floor cleaner, and the subtle, sweet smell of teenage boredom, felt heavy and stagnant. On the walls, posters of famous mathematicians, Archimedes, Euler, Gauss, Newton, stared down with stoic, monochrome expressions. They were all white, all men, all long dead, their portraits serving less as inspiration and more as a kind of historical wallpaper. The students, slumped in their chairs, mirrored the lethargy of the room. They were restless, their minds already escaped, wandering the weekend paths of parties, video games, and sleep. All except for two, side by side. In the third row sat Malik and Marcus Johnson. Identical twins, 17 years old, they were a study in focused energy, an island of alertness in a sea of adolescent apathy. Their postures were straight, their eyes fixed on their teacher, Mrs. Davison. They shared a silent language, a lifetime of unspoken communication that flowed between them in subtle glances, the slight arch of an eyebrow, the barest twitch of a smile. It was a language of shared thought, a bond that was as mysterious to outsiders as it was natural to them. Mrs. Davison stood at the front of the room, a woman in her late 50s whose stern expression seemed less a temporary mood and more a permanent feature, etched into her face by decades of enforcing rules and demanding rigor. She believed in process, in the methodical, step-by-step journey to an answer. Deviation was a sign of sloppiness, and she had no patience for it. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 20 minutes left, not enough time for a new lesson, too much time to let them descend into chaos. "Now, class," she announced, her voice cutting through the low hum of whispered conversations. "For the remainder of the period, we're going to try something different, an extra credit opportunity." A few students perked up, the words extra credit, a Pavlovian trigger for the grade, conscious. She turned and began writing on the chalkboard, her chalk strokes sharp and precise. "This is a thought experiment. It's a variation of a famous problem, one I call the Langston-Fermat conjecture." "I want to be perfectly clear," she said, turning back to face them, a thin layer of white dust on her fingertips. "You are not expected to solve this. The world's greatest minds have tried and failed for 2 decades. The point of this exercise is not to find the answer, but to demonstrate your problem-solving process. I want to see how you think." As she spoke, a collective groan rippled through the classroom. It was a trick, a thinking exercise disguised as a reward. But as the rest of the class deflated, a flicker of something else passed between Malik and Marcus. It wasn't arrogance or the competitive fire of overachievers. It was pure, unadulterated curiosity. While their classmates doodled in their notebooks or stared blankly at the board, the twins leaned forward in unison. Their pencils were already in hand, poised and ready. Mrs. Davison watched them from the corner of her eye, a familiar flicker of suspicion clouding her expression. She had seen that look before, that shared, intense concentration. She misinterpreted it, as she always did, not as intellectual synergy, but as the silent plotting of a collaborative shortcut. For Malik, the equation wasn't just a string of symbols on a dusty chalkboard. As he stared at it, the numbers and variables lifted off the surface, blooming in his mind's eye into a complex, shimmering structure. He saw it as a geometric form, a twisting, multi-dimensional object, suspended in the dark space of his imagination. He began sketching in his notebook, not writing equations, but drawing shapes, elegant polyhedra connected by graceful arching lines. He saw the conjecture as a flaw in this beautiful structure, a tiny crack in its otherwise perfect symmetry. Beside him, Marcus watched his brother's hand move, but he saw something entirely different. He didn't see the shapes or the ethereal structure. He saw the underlying axioms, the cold, hard rules of logic that governed the universe of numbers. While Malik's mind danced with intuition, Marcus's marched with rigorous, unassailable logic. He began to outline a sequence, a step-by-step assault on the problem, translating the abstract challenge into a concrete plan of attack. Their two minds, one visual and intuitive, the other verbal and logical, began their silent, synchronous dance. Later that evening, their shared bedroom had become a sanctuary of numbers. The space was neat, almost Spartan, but it was dominated by two enormous whiteboards mounted on the main wall. They were covered, edge to edge, in a sprawling tapestry of equations, geometric proofs, and complex formulas, a testament to countless hours of intellectual exploration. Stacks of books on advanced calculus, number theory, and theoretical physics sat on their desks, their spines cracked and their pages filled with notes. They worked in a state of shared flow, the silence broken only by the squeak of markers on the whiteboard and the soft rustle of turning pages. Their work was a conversation, more intimate and efficient than any spoken words. Malik, the artist of the pair, would take a leap of faith. He would see a connection, a shortcut through the dense forest of the problem, and sketch it out in a flurry of lines and shapes. He closed his eyes, and the equation became a galaxy of points and lines, a celestial body whose gravitational pull he could feel. He saw the path to solving the conjecture, a path that flowed like water, bending around obstacles that had stopped others for years. He stepped back from the board, tapping a bizarre, looking dodecahedron he had just drawn. "It folds here," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "The plane intersects itself, but only if you assume it's flat. It's not. It's curved in a higher dimension." Marcus, the logician, nodded without even looking at the shape. He didn't need to see the picture. He understood the principle behind it. He saw the flaw in the initial axiom that Malik's shape revealed. He was already writing, his marker flying across the board, translating his brother's intuitive, visual proof into the formal, unassailable language of mathematics. Each line he wrote was a brick, precise and perfectly placed, building a fortress of logic around Malik's intuitive leap. "Which means the initial axiom is flawed," Marcus murmured, his focus absolute. "The variable isn't a constant in this dimension. It's a function of the curvature." He paused, his marker hovering. "I can prove it." The next morning, they walked into Mrs. Davison's classroom with a quiet sense of confidence. They had done it. They had spent half the night refining the proof, checking and rechecking every step, every assumption. The result was a multi-page solution, dense with logic and illustrated with Malik's strange, beautiful diagrams. They had each written it out, their handwriting the only subtle difference in two otherwise identical documents. They handed them in at the beginning of class, and Mrs. Davison accepted them with a tight, dismissive smile, placing them on the corner of her desk without a glance. The day wore on. It wasn't until her planning period, in the quiet of the empty classroom, that she finally turned to the papers. She picked up Malik's first, a sigh of weary obligation escaping her lips. Her eyebrows, which were thin and severely plucked, began to furrow as she read. The notation was unconventional, the geometric diagrams unlike anything she'd seen in a standard textbook. It was strange, but it had a bizarre, internal consistency. It was clearly nonsense, but it was elaborate nonsense. She put it down and picked up Marcus's paper. Her expression froze. It was an exact replica. The same unconventional notation, the same strange diagrams, the same multi-page, nonsensical argument. Her suspicion, which had been simmering since the day before, instantly hardened into a cold, hard certainty. The audacity of it, the sheer, lazy arrogance of submitting identical papers for her most challenging extra credit assignment, ignited a fuse of fury within her. This was not just cheating, it was a personal insult. She stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. Her face was a mask of cold rage. She walked to the classroom door, her heels clicking like tiny hammers on the linoleum, and pulled it open. Malik and Marcus were in the hallway, chatting with friends by their lockers. "Malik, Marcus," she called out, her voice low and sharp, slicing through the hallway chatter. The boys turned, their smiles fading as they saw her expression. "My office, now." Their faces registered pure, unadulterated shock. Confusion clouded their features. "Mrs. Davison," Malik started, taking a step forward. "Is something wrong?" "I will not tolerate this kind of blatant academic dishonesty in my classroom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of a verdict. She turned on her heel and marched toward the administrative offices, not waiting to see if they followed. The hallway, once a familiar and comfortable space, suddenly felt long and isolating. The curious faces of their classmates peered out from doorways, their whispers following the twins like a trail of smoke. The feeling of pride and accomplishment they had felt just moments before curdled into a sickening knot of dread and injustice. They exchanged a bewildered glance, their silent language for once failing them. They had no words, no gestures for this. They could only walk, one behind the other, following the rigid set of their teacher's shoulders toward a reckoning they did not understand. The door to the principal's office suite closed behind them, shutting out the world and sealing them in with their accuser. Principal Albright's office was the antithesis of the twins' bedroom. Where their room was a vibrant, chaotic testament to intellectual passion, this space was sterile, impersonal, and meticulously ordered. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and recycled air. Generic motivational posters, featuring eagles soaring over mountains with words like integrity and excellence printed in bold sans serif fonts, adorned the walls. They were the kind of decorations chosen by a committee to offend no one and inspire no one. A vast, gleaming mahogany desk sat between the principal and his visitors, less a piece of furniture and more a carefully polished barrier, a symbol of unbreachable authority. Principal Albright himself, a man in a tailored suit with a placid corporate smile, looked as if he had been chosen by the same committee. He spoke in a calm, measured tone, the kind of voice that could deliver a declaration of war with the same emotional temperature as the cafeteria's lunch menu. He glanced at the two papers Mrs. Davison had presented as Exhibit A, his eyes skimming over the complex equations and diagrams. He didn't understand the content, nor did he care to. He saw only the damning superficial truth. They were identical. He listened with a patient, practiced nod as Mrs. Davison laid out her report, her voice sharp with righteous indignation. "The school," Principal Albright began, steepling his fingers on the polished surface of the desk, "has a zero-tolerance policy on plagiarism. The evidence is, frankly, irrefutable." Two identical papers, on a problem of this complexity, submitted concurrently. It's an open and shut case. His gaze, devoid of any genuine curiosity, settled on the two boys. "But we didn't cheat," Marcus insisted, his voice earnest and clear, though a tremor of disbelief ran through it. He leaned forward, trying to breach the chasm of the desk. "We just arrived at the same answer. We work together, we talk through problems, but we think separately. The logic is the same because it's the correct logic. It's the only way the proof works." Mrs. Davison let out a short, sharp laugh that was devoid of humor. "Correct?" she scoffed, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "It's a nonsensical solution to an unsolvable problem. It's gibberish. The only thing correct here is that you copied it from the same source, or one of you copied the other. The audacity is what I find most offensive." The twins felt the air leave the room. Their explanations, so clear and true in their own minds, were being treated as childish lies. The weight of the institution, embodied by the two unyielding adults before them, felt crushing and absolute. They were trapped in a logic loop they couldn't break, their own brilliance twisted into a weapon against them. The tension in the office, already thick enough to be cut with a knife, ratcheted up to an unbearable degree when David and Sarah Johnson arrived. They had been summoned from their jobs, Sarah from a busy hospital ward and David from the greasy, honest world of his auto repair shop, and their faces were etched with a mixture of confusion and concern. David was a large man, his hands calloused and stained with the permanent memory of engine oil, but his gaze was steady and intelligent. Sarah, a nurse, had a face that was accustomed to projecting calm reassurance, but now it was a mask of fierce defiance, her eyes darting between the principal and her sons. They listened in stunned silence as Principal Albright recited the accusations in his placid, corporate drone, with Mrs. Davison adding sharp, accusatory interjections. The initial worry on the parents' faces slowly morphed into a simmering anger. They knew their boys, they knew their character, their honesty, and the unique, powerful synergy of their minds. "Let me get this straight," Sarah said, her voice dangerously quiet, her professional calm stripped away to reveal the raw nerve of a protective mother. "Are you telling me that you've called us away from our jobs to suspend our sons, who have never been in trouble a day in their lives, without even for a second considering that they might just be brilliant? Did you ask them to explain their work? Did you try to understand it?" Principal Albright offered a condescending smile. "Mrs. Johnson, with all due respect, we have to be realistic. The statistical probability of two students independently producing identical multi-page answers to a problem of this nature is, for all intents and purposes, virtually zero. It defies logic." It was David who spoke next, his voice a low, rumbling thunder that seemed to shake the sterile air of the office. He hadn't moved, but his presence suddenly seemed to fill the room. "No," he said, looking directly at Principal Albright, his gaze unwavering. "What defies your logic is what you see sitting in those chairs." The only thing you see is two black kids who did something you don't understand. So you didn't look for brilliance, you looked for a reason to punish. You didn't see a miracle, you saw a crime. A heavy, profound silence fell over the room. The accusation hung in the air, undeniable and deeply uncomfortable for the two administrators. Principal Albright's placid mask finally slipped. A flicker of anger, of indignation, crossed his face before he smoothed it away, retreating behind the safety of policy. He slid a set of papers across the mahogany desk. The suspension forms. "The decision is final," he said, his voice now cold and brittle. 2 weeks suspension, effective immediately, pending a formal expulsion hearing before the school board. The signing of the papers was a grim, silent ceremony. The scratch of the pen was the only sound, a final, damning verdict. The twins were officially outcasts. The walk to their lockers was a new kind of torture. The news had already spread through the school's hyper-efficient gossip network. Hallways were never truly silent, but this was a different kind of noise. It was a symphony of whispers, of furtive glances, of fingers pointing from a safe distance. Friends who had been laughing with them an hour ago now averted their eyes, suddenly fascinated by the contents of their own lockers or the scuff marks on their shoes. Each slam of a locker door felt like a judgment. The twins moved through the gauntlet in a bubble of numb disbelief, the metallic clang of their own locker doors shutting for the last time, echoing the finality of the principal's words. The ride home in the family's worn but reliable sedan was thick with a silence that was a living thing, heavy and suffocating. It pressed in on them, filling the space between their bodies. Sarah gripped her purse in her lap, her knuckles white, her jaw set in a line of rigid fury. David stared straight ahead at the road, his large hands clamped onto the steering wheel, his expression a mask of stoic, controlled rage. He was navigating the familiar streets of their neighborhood, but they felt alien, hostile. Malik stared out the passenger window, watching the world slide by in a blur of muted colors. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if he were watching a movie of his own life. The elegant, beautiful structure he had seen in his mind, the proof that had filled him with such a pure, clean joy, had been twisted into something ugly and shameful. Beside him in the back seat, Marcus stared down at his own hands. They were capable hands, hands that could translate the most complex, intuitive ideas into the unassailable language of logic. But they had failed him. He had failed. He hadn't been able to make them understand the truth. The feeling of failure was a cold, heavy stone in his stomach, not because he had done wrong, but because his logic, his words, his very way of seeing the world, had been utterly and completely powerless. That evening, in her quiet, orderly home, Diane Davison poured herself a glass of expensive red wine. The house was a reflection of her mind, everything in its proper place. Clean lines, muted colors, no room for mess or ambiguity. She felt a sense of grim satisfaction, the kind a person feels when a difficult but necessary task is completed. The situation had been handled. The rules, the bedrock of a civilized academic environment, had been upheld. Order had been restored. Yet, as she swirled the dark red liquid in her glass, watching the light catch its surface, a small, nagging splinter of doubt lodged itself in her mind. It was the memory of the twins' faces, the pure, unfeigned shock, the bewildered hurt in their eyes. It hadn't been the look of practiced liars caught in a clumsy deception. It had seemed so genuine. She took a sip of wine, the rich, complex flavor doing little to soothe the unfamiliar prickle of uncertainty. She needed to extinguish that doubt. She needed to reaffirm the correctness of her decision, to feel the solid ground of her own certainty beneath her feet again, to justify her actions, not just to the world, but to herself, and perhaps to get a validating chuckle from a superior mind. She walked over to her sleek, modern laptop. She opened her email, the memory of the boys' identical papers still vivid in her mind. The audacity, she muttered to herself, the word reinforcing her conviction. She scanned the pages of their work, her high-end scanner capturing every strange diagram and unconventional line of reasoning. She attached the file to a new message. The recipient was a name from her past, a ghost from her university days, Professor Alistair Finch. He had been her mentor, a titan in the field whose casual brilliance had both intimidated and inspired her. She hadn't spoken to him in years, but she knew he would appreciate the absurdity of this. He would see the foolishness she saw. She typed out the message, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Alistair," she began, adopting a familiar, collegial tone, "hope this email finds you well. A rather amusing situation came up today, and I thought of you. You won't believe the audacity of this one. I had to suspend 2 students for submitting these identical papers as a solution to an unsolvable problem I gave for extra credit. I thought you might get a laugh out of their so-called proof. Some of the notation is truly inventive. Let me know what you think. All the best, Diane. She hit send. The email vanished into the digital ether, a message in a bottle cast into a vast electronic sea. She closed her laptop with a decisive snap, the splinter of doubt now seemingly removed, or at least buried. She finished her wine, the grim satisfaction returning, and told herself, once again, that she had done the right thing. She had no way of knowing that she had just lit a fuse, a long, slow, burning fuse that would eventually lead to an explosion that would shatter her world and shake the very foundations of the one she so revered. Professor Alistair Finch's university office was a sanctuary of organized chaos, a physical manifestation of a mind in perpetual motion. It was less an office and more a nest, built from the accumulated detritus of a life spent in the abstract wilderness of higher mathematics. Books were not neatly shelved. They were stacked in precarious gravity-defying towers that leaned like ancient ruins, their spines a mosaic of titles on quantum mechanics, number theory, and non-Euclidean geometry. The whiteboards, layered with the ghosts of old equations, were a palimpsest of intellectual battles fought and won, each faint smudge a scar of a conquered problem. A half-eaten sandwich, its bread curling at the edges, sat on a copy of a prestigious mathematics journal, forgotten in the heat of some long, past moment of discovery. The air itself felt thick with thought, a mixture of old paper, cold coffee, and the faint electric hum of the ancient computer terminal in the corner. Alistair was engaged in the most tedious of academic rituals, clearing out his email inbox. It was a digital Sisyphean task, a daily battle against a tide of departmental memos, student inquiries about grade curves, and spam promising to enlarge things he did not possess. He deleted with a practiced rhythmic efficiency, his eyes glazing over. Spam, delete. Memo, delete. Student, reply with a canned response, delete. Then he saw the name, Diane Davison. It took him a moment to place her. A former student, he recalled vaguely, one of the diligent, unimaginative ones who had memorized formulas but never truly understood the music behind the math. He read her email with a profound sigh, the kind reserved for the uniquely wearying drama of lesser minds. Plagiarism, he muttered to the empty room, rolling his eyes so far back he felt a strain in his neck. The eternal student dilemma, too lazy to learn, too foolish to cheat well. He expected a clumsy, copy-pasted mess from a Wikipedia article or some obscure online journal. He opened the attached PDF file, his finger already hovering over the delete key, ready to give it a cursory glance, confirm the obvious, and move on with his day. He was already thinking about the Riemann hypothesis proof he was wrestling with, a far more interesting and worthy opponent. But he didn't hit delete. Something stopped him. His finger froze in midair. He leaned closer to the screen, his brow furrowing. The notation was unusual, almost amateurish in places, a strange hybrid of classical and invented symbols. Yet, the structure of the argument, the flow of the logic, it wasn't random. It didn't look like anything copied from a textbook or a known academic paper. Those were always polished, sanded down, their rough edges of discovery worn away. This was raw, unrefined, but it possessed a strange, powerful internal consistency. It had an elegance, a wild, untamed beauty, like a mathematical proof written by a poet who had never been taught grammar. It was wrong, of course, it had to be, but it was wrong in a way he had never seen before. Hours later, the sun had long since dipped below the horizon, and the only light in the office came from the focused, yellow cone of his desk lamp, casting long, dancing shadows that made the towers of books look like a miniature, nocturnal city. Alistair's initial annoyance had evaporated, replaced by a deep, consuming curiosity that had burned away all thoughts of food, sleep, or the departmental budget meeting he was now 6 hours late for. He had printed the papers, the crisp sheets spread across his desk like the sacred texts of some forgotten religion. He had pulled a dusty, leather-bound volume from a high shelf, the original publication of the Langston-Fermat conjecture from 20 years ago, its pages yellowed and brittle. He began to compare them, not looking for plagiarism, but for methodology, for the ghost of the thought process that had created this beautiful, impossible thing. The scene became a montage of intense, silent intellectual combat. Alistair paced the length of his small office, his wild mane of grey hair seeming to crackle with static electricity. He muttered to himself, fragments of equations and curses spilling from his lips in a low, continuous stream. He scribbled furiously on his own whiteboard, his marker a black blur, drawing arrows, crossing out entire sections, his coffee growing cold and oily in its mug. He forgot dinner. He ignored a call from his wife, swatting the ringing phone away like an irritating fly. The world outside his office door, with its deadlines and obligations, had ceased to exist. There was only the room, the papers, and the hunt. He was hunting for the flaw. He was certain it was there. A single, subtle miscalculation, a flawed axiom, a leap of logic that was a millimeter too wide. That was all it would take to bring the entire elegant structure crashing down, to prove it was all just the clever, elaborate nonsense he had first suspected. But he couldn't find it. Every time he thought he had it cornered, the proof would twist, it would pivot, it would reveal a new, hidden layer of complexity and grace that left him breathless. He felt a forgotten thrill, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, the pure, unadulterated adrenaline rush of genuine discovery. It was the feeling that had drawn him to mathematics in the first place, the joy of venturing into a dark, unknown territory with nothing but a lantern of pure logic. He kept thinking, this can't be right, but the math, the cold, hard, unforgiving math, kept telling him that it was. The twins' approach was completely, brilliantly novel. They had used a form of geometric topology that most of the mathematical community, himself included, had dismissed as a dead end for this type of number theory problem. They had treated the numbers not as discrete, fixed values, but as flexible, dynamic points in a multi-dimensional array, a fluid structure that could be bent and folded in on itself. It was unorthodox, it was wild, it was beautiful, and, as far as he could tell, it wasn't wrong. He could almost see the two minds at work, one making breathtaking intuitive leaps, visualizing the problem's collapse, the other following behind, meticulously paving the path with the stones of rigorous, unassailable proof. Dawn was breaking. A pale grey light, the color of ash, began to filter through the grimy window of his office, illuminating the motes of dust dancing in the air. Alistair stood before his whiteboard, which was now a perfect, annotated mirror of the twins' proof. His own frantic, scrawled notes surrounded their elegant logic, a testament to his long night's journey through their minds. He had followed their path, step by step, from their audacious initial assumption to their stunning conclusion. He picked up his marker, his hand unsteady, and drew the final connecting line, the one that locked the entire complex structure into place. It was perfect. It was a symphony. The marker dropped from his nerveless fingers. It clattered loudly in the profound silence of the room, the sound unnaturally sharp, like a bone snapping. He stumbled back a step, his legs suddenly weak, and sank into his worn leather chair. He stared at the board, at the sprawling, magnificent proof that now covered it from end to end, his mind a perfect, silent blank. The fury he had felt at Diane Davison's email, the academic weariness, the casual skepticism, it had all been burned away, leaving behind only a vast, empty space of pure, uncomprehending awe. Then, the silence was broken by his own whispered words, a prayer in the dawn-lit church of his office. "My God," he breathed, the words catching in his throat. "They did it. The kids, they actually solved it." A wave of emotions, powerful and conflicting, crashed over him. First came the awe, a profound, humbling reverence for the sheer, staggering brilliance of the proof. It was a work of art, a masterpiece of logic and intuition that would be studied for generations. Then came the fury, a hot, white, blazing rage directed at Diane Davison and the faceless, bureaucratic machine of a high school that could look at this miracle and see only cheating. The injustice of it was a physical sickness, a sour taste in the back of his throat. And finally, chasing the fury, came a profound, world-tilting excitement, the kind that changes lives and rewrites history. This was the biggest discovery of his lifetime, perhaps of the century, and it had been made not in a sterile university lab or a government think tank, but in the shared bedroom of two unknown, unseen, and unbelievably brilliant teenagers. He scrambled for his phone, his hands trembling so badly he could barely unlock the screen. He had to contact the school. He had to speak to these boys. He had to stop the colossal, idiotic mistake that was currently unfolding. He found the number for Northwood High and dialed, his heart pounding against his ribs. It was just after 6 in the morning. He was met with the flat, robotic voice of a generic answering machine, informing him that the office was closed. He hung up, a curse dying on his lips. He couldn't wait. He pulled his laptop towards him, his fingers flying across the keyboard, composing a new email. He sent it to Principal Albright and to Diane Davison, his thumb jabbing at the screen to add her to the recipient list. The subject line was a primal scream of urgency, typed in all capital letters, a digital siren in the quiet morning. Urgent. Regarding Malik and Marcus Johnson's papers. Principal Albright arrived at work at precisely 7:45 a.m., as he did every morning. His day began with a ritual of quiet, orderly tasks designed to set a tone of control and authority. He unlocked his office, the scent of last night's lemon polish still hanging in the air. He adjusted the blinds, allowing precisely measured slats of morning light to stripe his mahogany desk. He started his computer, the low hum a familiar and comforting sound. Then, he walked to the small, personal coffee machine in the corner and brewed a single, perfect cup of black coffee. Sipping it, he sat down and opened his email, ready to manage the small, predictable crises of a high school. He scanned the inbox, his eyes flicking past subject lines with practiced disinterest. Then he saw it. The all-caps subject line stood out like a scream in a library. Urgent, regarding Malik and Marcus Johnson's papers. The sender was a Professor Alistair Finch. Albright took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee, a small, knowing smile touching his lips. So, it had begun. The pressure campaign. He had expected it. He read the email, his smile widening into a smirk. The professor, some old academic from Northgate University, was claiming the boy's work was not only legitimate, but a monumental discovery. The language was hysterical, overwrought. So the family got some old professor friend to write an email, he thought, feeling a sense of smug satisfaction that warmed him more than the coffee. It was all so predictable. He saw the situation not as a search for truth, but as a simple challenge to his authority, a test of his resolve, and he would not be found wanting. This professor's histrionics didn't change the facts. The papers were identical. The policy was clear. To back down now would be to show weakness, to invite chaos. He dragged the email from his inbox and dropped it into the archive folder without a reply. The problem was dealt with. Meanwhile, in his own office, a space that looked as if it had been struck by a hurricane of pure thought, Alistair Finch was vibrating with an energy that was equal parts frustration and adrenaline. He was pacing, checking his email every 30 seconds, his body thrumming with the urgent need to act. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The silence from Northwood High was a deafening roar. His urgent, world-changing message had been met with nothing. It was like shouting into a vacuum. Finally, unable to bear the inaction any longer, he snatched the phone and dialed the school's main line again. After a series of clicks and automated menus, a human voice answered, a voice so utterly devoid of interest it sounded mechanically produced. "Northwood High, how may I direct your call?" the secretary asked in a bored, monotone drone. "Yes, I need to speak with Principal Albright immediately," Finch said, his voice tight with suppressed urgency. "My name is Professor Alistair Finch. It's a matter of extreme importance concerning two of his students, Malik and Marcus Johnson." There was a pause, filled with the faint sound of typing. "Mr. Albright is in meetings all day," the voice replied, flat and final. "You can leave a message." "This isn't a message," Finch exploded, his voice rising. He couldn't help it. The sheer, bureaucratic density of the situation was maddening. This is about a monumental scientific discovery. This is about a profound injustice. You don't understand. The school has made a terrible, terrible mistake. There was another pause, this one colder. "Sir," the secretary said, her voice now laced with a faint metallic edge of annoyance, "I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice." And then, before Finch could utter another word, there was a soft, final click. She had hung up. He stood there, the dial tone buzzing in his ear, a sound that had never before seemed so mocking, so utterly dismissive of genius and truth. While Professor Finch was hitting a wall of institutional indifference, a different kind of work was happening in the Johnsons' garage. The space smelled of oil, metal, and the quiet dignity of hard work. It was David's domain, a place of tangible problems and real, physical solutions. In the center of the garage, gleaming under the fluorescent lights, sat the half-restored frame of a 1969 Mustang. It was his long-term project, a labor of love and mechanics. After the soul-crushing silence of the car ride home the day before, he had known the boys needed something to do, something to anchor them. He got them to help, showing them how to clean a carburetor, how to gap a spark plug. He moved with a slow, deliberate confidence, his large hands, which could seem clumsy, proving to be incredibly deft and precise as he handled the intricate metal parts. He was trying to keep their spirits up, but more than that, he was trying to teach them something, to remind them of a truth they might be starting to doubt. He held up a distributor cap, pointing to the contacts inside. "See?" he said. his voice a low, comforting rumble. Everything has to work together. The fuel, the air, the spark. It all has to happen in the right order, at the right time. If one part is wrong, if the timing is off by even a fraction of a second, the whole thing fails. It's logical. It's a system. There's a truth to it. He looked from the car part to his sons' faces, his gaze steady and full of a fierce, quiet pride. Don't you ever let anyone tell you your logic is wrong just because they're too lazy or too scared to understand it. The words landed. Malik and Marcus looked at each other. They weren't defeated. The injustice stung. The humiliation was a fresh wound, but the fire inside them hadn't been extinguished. It had been banked, smothered by the weight of the accusation, but their father's words were like a breath of fresh air, fanning the embers back into a flame. The problem, the beautiful, elegant problem, had become their entire world, a fortress of certainty in a world that had suddenly become arbitrary and unjust. That afternoon they took some of the money they had saved from summer jobs and went to an office supply store. They came back not with video games or junk food, but with a new, larger whiteboard, a massive 8x4-foot sheet of pure, unblemished white. They mounted it on the wall of the garage, next to the Mustang. It dwarfed their old bedroom boards, a blank canvas for a bigger, bolder statement. They weren't just refining their proof anymore. They were expanding it, adding new sections, anticipating every possible objection, strengthening every logical link, making their argument so overwhelmingly, undeniably powerful that no one, not a teacher, not a principal, not a school board, could ever dismiss it again. They were building a fortress of logic, and this time they were making sure the walls were impenetrable. Late that afternoon, Professor Finch sat slumped in his chair, his office feeling less like a sanctuary and more like a prison. He was at his wits' end. He had been stonewalled, dismissed, and treated like a crank. He had tried the formal academic approach, a polite but urgent inquiry from one professional to another, and had been met with a slammed door. He finally understood. The administration wasn't interested in the truth. They were interested in control. They had made a decision, and their institutional pride was now inextricably linked to it. To admit they were wrong would be to admit fallibility, and the system he was dealing with was not built to accommodate that. He felt a hot paternal rage building in his chest, a protective fury on behalf of two boys he had never met. He thought about the long, sad history of science, of all the times genius had been overlooked, dismissed, or actively punished by a rigid, unthinking system. He thought of Galileo, of Turing, of countless others whose brilliance was seen as a threat. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this wasn't just about a math problem anymore. It was about a profound and potentially tragic injustice. He could publish the proof himself, of course, but the credit would be his, and the story of the boys who had actually done the work would be lost, a footnote in a history they should have owned. He needed a bigger lever. He needed to pry this story out of the closed, stale rooms of Northwood High and into the light. He swiveled in his chair and pulled an old battered Rolodex from a drawer, a relic from a pre-digital age. He flipped through the cards, his fingers searching for a name, for a number he hadn't used in years. He found it. Chloe Davis, a sharp, tenacious investigative reporter for the city's largest newspaper. He had given her a quote for a story on university funding cuts a few years back and had been impressed by her intelligence and her refusal to be spun. She wasn't just a reporter, she was a bulldog. He took a deep breath, the decision solidifying in his mind. He picked up the phone and dialed her number, his heart beginning to pound with a new kind of energy, the energy of a counterattack. She answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional. Chloe Davis. Chloe, it's Alistair Finch from Northgate University, he said, his voice low and steady, imbued with all the authority he could muster. I know this is out of the blue, but I have a story for you, and I promise it's the most important one you'll hear all year. It's about two brilliant high school kids, a corrupt and incompetent school administration, and a scientific discovery that is going to change the world. The Johnson family living room was modest, impeccably clean, and filled with the quiet warmth of a home built on love, not money. Framed photographs crowded the mantelpiece and side tables, a visual history of two boys growing up, toothy grins at birthday parties, awkward school pictures, proud moments in matching basketball uniforms. It was into this sanctuary of normal life that Chloe Davis stepped, her reporter's notebook feeling like an intrusion. She had heard Professor Finch's side of the story, a tale of academic outrage and world-changing discovery. Now, she needed to see the human side for herself. The family was wary, their collective posture a defensive huddle. Sarah Johnson offered her coffee with a polite but guarded smile, her eyes never leaving Chloe's face. David sat in his favorite armchair, his large arms crossed over his chest, his expression a mask of watchful silence. The twins, Malik and Marcus, sat on the sofa, their shoulders almost touching, a silent, unified front of withdrawal. They looked younger than 17, their brilliance eclipsed by the shadow of the school's judgment. Chloe began not with an interrogation, but with an invitation. She just listened, letting them tell the story in their own words, her pen still. She heard the confusion, the hurt, and the deep, unyielding frustration of being disbelieved. "Professor Finch says you've done something remarkable," Chloe said gently, after the initial torrent of their story had subsided into a tense silence. "The school says you cheated. I've read the papers, and I'll be honest, the math is beyond me." She looked directly at the twins, her gaze open and curious. "Can you show me what you did? I'm not a mathematician, so you'll have to explain it to me like I'm 5. The request hung in the air. It was the first time anyone from outside their small circle had asked to understand, rather than to judge. Hesitantly, Marcus glanced at Malik, a silent question passing between them. Malik gave a barely perceptible nod. They stood up and, with a shared, nervous glance back at their parents, led Chloe not to a desk, but out the back door and into the garage. The moment she stepped inside, Chloe understood that this was the real heart of the home. The air smelled of oil and metal, but also of the electric, charged energy of creation. Next to the hulking half-assembled frame of a classic Mustang, a monument to tangible logic, stood the whiteboard. It was massive, a gleaming white monolith that was almost completely filled with their elegant, impossibly complex proof. It was a breathtaking sight, a sprawling city of numbers and symbols, beautiful and intimidating. As the twins stood before it, a remarkable transformation occurred. Their shyness, their withdrawn and wounded posture, simply melted away. It was as if a light had been switched on inside them. Their passion for the subject, a pure, intellectual fire, lit up their faces. They started to explain. They talked over each other, not in a chaotic way, but like two musicians playing a complex duet, each one picking up the melody where the other left off. Malik's hands danced in the air, shaping invisible geometric forms as he described the problem's higher, dimensional curvature. Marcus followed, his words a torrent of precise, logical steps, anchoring his brother's intuitive leaps to the bedrock of mathematical law. "You have to see that the variable isn't a fixed point," Malik said, his eyes alight with excitement. "It's a relationship. It changes depending on where you are in the structure, which means the foundational axiom everyone else was using is incomplete." Marcus cut in seamlessly, tapping a dense block of equations on the board. They assumed a constant where none exists. Once you define it as a function of the curvature, the whole thing unlocks. Chloe Davis did not understand the math. She didn't grasp the nuances of multi-dimensional arrays or the implications of a variable constant. But she understood passion. She understood sincerity. She saw the way their eyes shone, the effortless synergy of their shared mind, the sheer, unadulterated joy they took in the beauty of their own logic. She glanced back at David and Sarah, who stood near the doorway, watching their sons with tears welling in their proud, tired eyes. In that moment, Chloe's professional skepticism, the healthy, necessary doubt of a seasoned journalist, vanished completely. It was replaced by a cold, hard, and deeply personal anger. This wasn't a story about cheating. This was a story about a profound and terrible injustice, and she was going to burn it to the ground. The next day, Chloe Davis walked into the main entrance of Northwood High. She wasn't accompanied by a camera crew or a sound guy. She carried only her press badge, a notepad, and a look of unwavering determination. She had her story. She had her expert, and now she was here for the final piece, the confrontation. She requested an immediate interview with Principal Albright. As she expected, she was made to wait. For 45 minutes she sat on a hard plastic chair in the main office, watching the bland, bureaucratic rhythm of the school, a place that now felt less like an institution of learning and more like a fortress of denial. Finally, she was ushered into the same sterile office where the twins' fate had been sealed. Principal Albright, planning to give her a generic and dismissive no comment, greeted her with his polished, corporate smile. "As I'm sure you understand, Ms. Davis," he began, settling behind the barrier of his mahogany desk, "this is an internal disciplinary matter, and due to student privacy laws, I simply can't comment on the specifics of any individual case." Chloe didn't even bother to open her notepad. She leaned forward, her expression sharp and serious. "I'm not asking about a disciplinary matter, Mr. Albright. I'm asking why you suspended 2 students for correctly solving the Langston-Fermat conjecture, a problem that has stumped the global mathematics community for 20 years. She let the statement hang in the air for a beat before delivering the final blow. I have a statement from Professor Alistair Finch of Northgate University, a leading mind in theoretical mathematics, who is prepared to go on the record stating that their proof is not only legitimate but, and I quote, a work of staggering genius. Would you like to comment on that? The color drained from Principal Albright's face. His polished smile evaporated, leaving behind the slack, stunned expression of a man who had just been checkmated. The name Professor Alistair Finch was not some vague academic his pressure campaign could dismiss. It was a name that carried immense weight, a name that lent unimpeachable credibility to the story. The confidence in Chloe's tone, the precision of her question, told him that this was not a problem that could be archived or ignored. He was cornered, trapped between his own rigid, prideful decision and the oncoming tidal wave of a national news story. He knew, in that sickening stomach-dropping moment, that he had made a catastrophic mistake, and the world was about to find out. Chloe's article was published on the newspaper's website just after 9 p.m. that evening. The headline was a masterstroke of provocative journalism: Geniuses or Cheaters, High School Suspends Twins Who Solved Famous Math Problem. It was an explosive, meticulously detailed account of the events, weaving together the cold fury of Professor Finch, the quiet dignity of the Johnson family, the breathtaking image of the whiteboard in the garage, and the cold, bureaucratic dismissiveness of the Northwood High administration. The story did not just get views, it detonated. Within an hour, it was the most read article on the site. On Twitter, the hashtags #MathTwins and #Northwood High scandal began to trend, first locally, then nationally. Memes appeared, juxtaposing the faces of the twins with famous mathematicians, and Principal Albright's face with images of dunce caps. The story was picked up by national news outlets. Cable news channels ran segments on it, and the school's phone lines became so jammed with calls from angry parents, alumni, and reporters from across the country that the system crashed. The school board's website, flooded with traffic, went dark. In her quiet, orderly home, Diane Davison was scrolling through the news on her tablet, a half-full glass of wine on the coaster beside her. She saw the headline, and her heart gave a painful lurch. She clicked on it, her hand trembling slightly. She read the article, her breath catching in her chest. She saw Finch's quotes, his passionate defense of the proof's brilliance, his fury at the injustice. She saw the description of the twins' passion, the way they lit up when explaining their work. She saw the photograph Chloe had taken of the massive whiteboard, a universe of logic she had dismissed as gibberish. The wineglass she was holding, forgotten in her hand, slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers. It did not just fall, it seemed to leap, shattering on her pristine hardwood floor, the dark red wine spreading like a pool of blood. The sound barely registered. She was staring at the screen, at the faces of the 2 boys she had so smugly and confidently condemned. It wasn't just that she was wrong, it was the magnitude, the sheer, colossal scale of her wrongness, her certainty, her pride, her prejudice. It all came crashing down on her in a sickening, dizzying wave. She had looked at 2 young black men, seen their shared brilliance as a conspiracy, and in her arrogance, she had not just made a mistake in judgment, she had committed a profound failure of character. She had seen what she expected to see, not the miracle that was right in front of her. The shame was not an emotion, it was a physical sickness, a toxic heat that rose from her stomach and burned in her throat. She had almost ruined them. She had tried to extinguish a fire that was meant to light up the world. The auditorium at Northgate University was electric, a cavernous space humming with the kinetic energy of a major media event. Dozens of cameras, their red recording lights like a constellation of malevolent eyes, were pointed at the brightly lit stage. Reporters from every major news network jostled for position, their murmured conversations a low, expectant roar. This was no dry academic lecture, it was a spectacle. In the front row, the Johnson family sat in a tight, protective unit, looking overwhelmed but profoundly dignified. Sarah held David's hand, her knuckles white, silent tears tracing paths down her cheeks, tears not of sorrow, but of a vast, explosive pride. David sat straight and tall, his mechanic's hands resting on his knees, his steady presence a silent anchor in the swirling chaos. He looked at his sons on the stage, and for the first time in 2 weeks, the deep, angry lines around his eyes began to soften. On the stage, Malik and Marcus sat on either side of a beaming Professor Finch, with the university's dean, a woman with sharp eyes and a warm smile, seated beside them. The twins looked out at the sea of faces, a mixture of terror and vindication warring in their expressions. They were wearing new suits, slightly stiff and unfamiliar, a stark contrast to the comfortable, worn clothes they lived in. They looked like themselves, yet transformed, caught in the blinding spotlight of a world that had, overnight, decided they were worthy of attention. Professor Finch, his wild grey hair seeming to vibrate with the energy in the room, stepped to the podium. A hush fell over the auditorium. He looked out at the crowd, his eyes finding the twins, and he gave them a small, encouraging nod. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice resonating with a passion that instantly commanded the room. "We are here today to correct a record. But more than that, we are here to celebrate a moment of profound and unexpected brilliance." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. For 20 years, the Langston-Fermat conjecture has been a mountain in the landscape of theoretical mathematics. The brightest minds of a generation have attempted to climb it. We have tried every path, every approach. We have thrown all of our collective knowledge and computational power at its sheer, unforgiving rock face. And for 20 years, we have failed. He gestured towards Malik and Marcus. For 20 years, we were all trying to climb the same mountain. We thought it was the only way to the top. Malik and Marcus Johnson didn't climb the mountain. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow more powerful than a shout. They found a way to fly. They recontextualized the entire problem. They saw it not as a linear ascent, but as a folded, multi-dimensional structure. They didn't break the rules. They revealed that we were all playing the wrong game, using a rulebook that was fundamentally incomplete. He began to pace the stage, his excitement too great to be contained by the podium. This isn't just a solution, it's a paradigm shift. It's a new language. Their work will have implications for cryptography, for making our digital world more secure. It will have implications for theoretical physics, for helping us understand the very fabric of the universe. It will open up fields of study we haven't even invented yet. It is, and I do not say this lightly, breathtaking. He stopped and looked directly at the cameras, his expression one of fierce, unyielding conviction. What these two young men have accomplished, in the quiet of their bedroom, with nothing but their own minds, is a work of staggering, world-changing genius, and the system that should have recognized it, that should have nurtured it, instead sought to punish it. That is the tragedy we are here to correct. The genius, however, could not be contained. A wave of applause, spontaneous and thunderous, erupted through the auditorium. Malik and Marcus looked at each other, a slow, dawning smile spreading across both of their faces. The dean of the university then took the podium, her own smile wide and genuine. "Professor Finch is correct," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Genius cannot be contained, and it must be fostered. Northgate University prides itself on being a home for the brightest minds in the world." She turned to the twins. "Malik, Marcus, on behalf of the Board of Trustees and the entire faculty, it is my profound honor to announce that the university is offering both of you full 4-year scholarships." A gasp went through the crowd. "This scholarship," she continued, her voice rising over the renewed buzz, "will cover the full cost of tuition, all fees, room and board, and includes a personal research stipend and direct mentorship from Professor Finch. It is a package valued at over $300,000 for each of you." As she spoke, an aide hurried onto the stage and whispered urgently in her ear, handing her a phone. The dean looked at the screen, and her smile grew even wider. She looked back at the audience, a mischievous twinkle in her eye. "Well," she said, with a dramatic flair that delighted the reporters, "it seems I must amend my statement. I have just been informed that both MIT and Caltech have been trying to reach the Johnson family to make their own competing offers. It appears we have a bidding war on our hands." The room exploded. The applause was deafening, the flashbulbs a blinding, continuous strobe. On stage, Malik and Marcus were no longer just vindicated students. They were the most sought-after intellectual properties in the world. In the front row, David Johnson put his arm around his wife, and for the first time, he laughed, a deep, booming laugh of pure, unadulterated joy. In the chaotic, joyful aftermath of the press conference, the family tried to navigate the crush of, wishers, reporters, and university faculty, all wanting to shake the hands of the two new titans of mathematics. As they moved through a hallway just outside the auditorium, a figure stepped out from a shadowed alcove, blocking their path. It was Mrs. Davison. She looked smaller than they remembered, diminished as if the weight of her mistake had physically compressed her. The stern, rigid posture was gone, replaced by a fragile slump. Her face, Once a mask of cold certainty was now pale and etched with lines of profound regret. She looked older. Principal Albright was nowhere to be seen, a conspicuous absence that spoke volumes. He had, as the news reports would later confirm, tendered his resignation that morning, citing personal reasons. Mrs. Davison approached them hesitantly, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes fixed on the twins. She seemed unable to speak, her throat working silently. Sarah Johnson took a protective step forward, her expression hardening, but David put a gentle hand on her arm. Mrs. Davison finally began, her voice a trembling, broken whisper. There are no words. There is no excuse for what I did. Her eyes, glistening with unshed tears, met Malik's, then Marcus's. It wasn't just a mistake in judgment. It was a failure of character, a complete and total failure. Her voice cracked, but she forced herself to continue. The confession, a torrent of self-recrimination. My pride, my prejudice. I saw what I expected to see, not what was right there in front of me. I saw two boys I didn't understand, and I chose the easiest, ugliest explanation. I was wrong. Completely, utterly, and shamefully wrong. She took a ragged breath. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve it. But I needed to tell you, to your faces, how profoundly and deeply sorry I am for the pain I caused you, for the doubt I put in your hearts. I am so sorry. The hallway was silent, save for the distant din of the reception. The twins looked at her, their expressions unreadable. They had been carried on a tidal wave of vindication, celebrated by the world. Here, in this quiet hallway, was the source of their pain, a broken woman offering a shattered apology. They looked at each other, a lifetime of communication passing in a single glance. They had a future to look forward to, a universe of numbers to explore. They would not be anchored by her past mistake. The apology, they both understood, was necessary for her, not for them. It was the first step of her own, lonely journey toward redemption. Marcus gave a short, sharp nod. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was an acknowledgement, a closing of a chapter. It was enough. Mrs. Davison seemed to understand. A single tear finally escaped and rolled down her cheek. She nodded back, a gesture of gratitude, and then, without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows from which she had emerged. 1 year later, the sprawling, beautiful campus of Northgate University was bathed in the golden light of a perfect autumn afternoon. Students strolled across the main quad, their laughter carrying on the crisp air. Malik and Marcus walked among them, books tucked under their arms. They were no longer boys, but young men, their faces having lost the last vestiges of adolescent uncertainty. They wore university sweatshirts, moving with the easy, confident stride of people who belonged. They were deep in conversation, their heads bent over a shared notebook, their hands gesturing emphatically. They were arguing, but there were bright smiles on their faces. They were home. The world had tested them, not with an unsolvable equation, but with a far more common and insidious problem: prejudice. They had faced a system that was quick to judge and slow to believe, a system that saw their brilliance as a transgression. But their shared language of numbers, a truth they had nurtured in the quiet of their room, had become a voice so clear, so powerful, it could not be silenced. Their journey was never just about solving a problem that had stumped the world for 20 years. It was about solving the equation of their own future, proving not just a theorem, but their own undeniable, irrefutable worth. And as they walked toward the grand stone library, ready to tackle the next great unknown, their argument dissolving into shared laughter, it was clear to anyone who saw them that they had only just begun.